Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we are strapping in for a bit of a journey far north to the rugged mountains of Scandinavia, Norway specifically. We are diving headfirst into a dish that, well, it requires some daring, definitely precision, and an almost frightening amount of patience. Rakfisk.
It's quite something.
It really is. And this isn't just, fermented fish in general sense. It's really a testament to necessity and time. It's a delicacy that completely skips the stove.
Right.
And uses the long, cold winter as its master chef. The result is pretty intense.
Oh, yeah.
A bold, sharp aroma, a texture that's really silky, almost buttery, and this deep, savory, salty flavor that just screams traditional Nordic cuisine.
Definitely defines it in many ways.
So our mission today is to give you a kind of shortcut to understanding this really fascinating process. We've looked at the sources of its history, the precise microbiology involved.
Which is key.
And the profound cultural significance of this Norwegian tradition. The big question we're trying to answer is, how do you actually take simple freshwater trout and turn it into this culinary masterpiece using basically nothing but salt, pressure, and, well, perfectly controlled decay?
It's a fantastic case study, really, in ingenuity, and it comes directly from survival.
Right.
Rakfisk's origins are purely practical. I mean, think back centuries. Norwegians living way up high in these remote mountain villages.
Isolated.
Totally, facing these incredibly unforgiving winters where, getting fresh supplies was just impossible sometimes. They needed a really robust, reliable way to preserve high-protein food.
Makes sense.
And fermentation was that ingenious solution. It let them turn the plentiful trout or char from the lakes into a staple food that could actually last for months.
Wow. And before we get knee-deep in the brine itself, let's quickly just nail down the name.
Yeah.
Because Rakfisk, it actually tells you a lot.
It does, yeah.
It's wonderfully literal, comes straight from Old Norse. Rak apparently means wet or soaked.
And fisk, well, that's fish. So you're essentially preparing and eating wet fish.
Yeah.
Perfectly captures that final brine-soaked state, doesn't it?
It really does. Simple and descriptive.
Okay, so let's unpack the core process, because this isn't just like leaving fish out. It needs almost scientific precision.
Absolutely.
It starts maybe counterintuitively with the fish selection and prep. Of course, you need incredibly fresh trout, clear eyes, firm flesh, the usual size.
Standard stuff for quality.
But here's the most crucial bit, and maybe the most surprising thing from all the source material. The cleaned and gutted fish. It's never rinsed with water.
Yeah, and that sounds completely wrong to most people today, right? Wash everything.
Exactly, but why? Why avoid the rinse?
Because you're relying completely on the fish's own natural microbial ecosystem. Water would just wash away the specific beneficial bacteria you need. We're talking primarily about lactic acid bacteria.
Okay.
They naturally live on the skin and in the gills. These little guys are what actually drive the safe fermentation process. If you wash them off, you lose your starter culture.
Exactly. You've got nothing to kick things off properly.
That is such a critical distinction. Okay, so you've got your non-rinsed, perfectly natural trout. Now comes the real balancing act, the salt.
Ah, the salt, yes.
It's the main preservative, obviously, but the sources really stress how thin the margin for error is here.
It's incredibly thin. The ideal ratio they talk about is between 6 and 8% salt by weight.
Just a 2% window.
Just 2%, that's what, 60 to 80 grams of salt for every kilogram of fish? And that tiny difference is everything. It's success versus, well, disaster.
Okay, so what happens if you go too high, say 9 or 10%?
Well, if you go too high, the salt concentration basically creates an environment that inhibits all the bacteria, even the good ones, the lactic acid bacteria we need. So the fish doesn't really ferment properly. It just becomes sort of salt cured. You won't get that characteristic Rakfisk texture or that deep flavor. It just stops the process cold.
But the real danger is going too low. Right, if you use, say, only 4% salt.
That's where it gets properly dangerous. If the salt concentration drops below that sort of minimum threshold, it just fails to stop the dangerous anaerobic pathogens from growing.
Like botulism.
Exactly. The scary thing here is that the primary safety mechanism against things like Clostridium botulinum, which, causes botulism and loves low oxygen, low acid places, isn't just the salt itself.
Oh.
It's the work that the lactic acid bacteria do afterwards. They produce acid, lactic acid, and that rapidly drops the pH of the whole mixture, making it safe.
I see.
So if you have too little salt, those dangerous spores, like botulinum spores, can actually germinate and reproduce before the good bacteria have had a chance to make the environment acidic enough to stop them. It's literally a microbiological race against time.
Wow. And it all hinges on that initial salt measurement.
Precisely. Get the salt wrong, and the race is lost before it starts.
Okay, so assuming you've nailed the salt, the fish gets packed really tightly into a clean barrel or some kind of container. Now we move on to the environment, right? Getting rid of the air.
Correct. You have to eliminate the oxygen. So you introduce weights. Traditionally might be a clean plate with a clean stone on top.
Right.
Anything to press the fish down and make sure it stays fully submerged in the brine that the salt naturally pulls out of the fish flesh. This creates that essential anaerobic environment.
Anaerobic meaning without oxygen.
Exactly. And this is where, the magic and the danger really happens. The moment that fish is submerged, sealed off from the air, two types of breakdown really get going.
Okay.
We already talked about the lactic acid bacteria starting their work, producing acid, dropping the pH for safety. But at the same time, the fish's own enzymes start breaking down its proteins.
So that's the enzymatic activity the sources kept mentioning, autolysis.
Precisely. Autolysis, the fish, is essentially kind of digesting itself from the inside out. Those enzymes, naturally present in the trout's muscle tissue, start snipping the complex proteins into smaller pieces, like amino acids.
And that creates the texture.
That's what creates that incredibly soft, buttery texture and builds the foundation for the deep umami flavor. But, crucially, this autolysis needs to be controlled. And that brings us to the most critical element of all, really, temperature.
Right. This is where it gets really sophisticated, isn't it? The temperature isn't just one setting. It's like conducting an orchestra. A two-stage act, the sources said. Why start warmer?
Yeah, it's two stages. You need that initial burst of activity. So stage 1 needs slightly warmer conditions, typically 5 to 8 degrees Celsius. What's that? 41 to 46 Fahrenheit.
Okay, for about a week.
Yeah, roughly for the first week. This temperature range is just high enough to significantly speed up both the lactic acid bacteria colonizing and multiplying.
Getting that pH down quick.
Exactly. And also accelerating that autolytic breakdown of the proteins by the fish's own enzymes. You're essentially kickstarting the whole transformation and safety process.
Okay, makes sense. Get things moving. So after that quick start, what happens in stage 2? You slow it down.
Then you basically hit the brakes. For stage 2, the fish moves to much colder storage. We're talking 2 to 4 degrees Celsius, so maybe 36 to 39 Fahrenheit.
It's just above freezing.
Pretty much. And it stays there for the rest of the time, typically 6 to 12 weeks, although sometimes even longer, depending on preference.
And why the cold?
This cold temperature slows everything right down dramatically. The process shifts from that rapid transformation phase to a slow, measured refinement. This longer, colder stage is absolutely essential for developing the deep, complex, nuanced flavor and achieving that really coveted, soft, almost spreadable texture without letting the fish just over-ripen or turn to mush.
It really is cooked by time, not heat, as they say.
That's the perfect Norwegian saying for it. Time and cold are the chefs.
So after all that patience, potentially months,
Yeah.
you finally get to the reward. How do you know when it's actually ready?
Yeah.
When you've hit perfection? It must come down to smell and taste, which are famously powerful.
Oh, they are powerful. And the sources are very specific here. The aroma should be, the description is sharp and oceanic. It's undeniably potent, no question. But, and this is critical, it must never carry the scent of actual decay or rot. If it smells aggressively bad, genuinely putrid, then something went wrong in the process.
Right.
A successful batch smells concentrated, like the essence of the sea maybe, with that definite sharpness coming from the lactic acid. Pungent, but clean in its own way.
Okay, pungent but clean. And then when you finally taste it, what's that ideal Rakfisk flavor profile?
The flavor needs to balance that touch of sourness, that's the lactic acid payoff, right, with this incredible depth. And that depth is pure, robust umami.
Ah, umami.
Remember those enzymes breaking down the complex proteins during autolysis?
Yeah.
That process releases massive amounts of free amino acids, particularly glutamates. And glutamates are basically the scientific definition of umami. So that rich, savory depth and that buttery mouthfeel, they're literally the result of the fish's own structure breaking down perfectly.
That makes the whole transformation seem even more amazing. Now, on texture, you mentioned something earlier, a pro tip about adding sugar. That sounds weird for a savory dish. Why add sugar?
Yeah, it's not about making it sweet for us to taste. It's purely about feeding those microscopic chefs the lactic acid bacteria.
Ah,
Adding just a small pinch of sugar during the salting process gives them an extra, easily accessible fuel source. It just ensures they have enough energy to multiply rapidly, produce that lactic acid quickly, win that safety race we talked about,
right.
and it also contributes subtly to the overall flavor complexity in the end product. It's food for the bacteria, not for us.
Fascinating. Okay, so once this piece of fermented history is finally ready, how do you actually eat it? It doesn't sound like something you just, flake onto a salad.
No, definitely not. Rakfisk is always served cold, always raw, and typically sliced paper thin.
Thin? Okay.
It's often seen as a celebratory dish, especially cherished during the winter months like November and December. And the traditional way to serve it is on a kind of rustic platter, designed to balance out that intense saltiness and sharpness.
So we're talking about those classic, sturdy Norwegian accompaniment.
Exactly. Things like small boiled potatoes, maybe almond potatoes, rich sour cream, they call it rum, sharp raw onions, often red onions, sliced thin, and the indispensable Norwegian flatbread. Flatbread.
Right. So the idea is the blandness of the potato, the fat and the sour cream, they cut through the intensity of the fish.
Precisely. It's about balance. The potatoes provide a neutral base, the sour cream adds richness and cuts the salt, the onion gives a sharp counterpoint, and the flatbread is for scooping it all up. It's a whole sensory package.
Sounds like quite an experience.
It really connects you right back to those mountain traditions, those cabins. It's fundamentally a communal meal, often shared around holidays or special gatherings. And you see that pride played out every year at the Rakfisk Festival in Valdres. Thousands of people gather there just to taste different regional variations, argue about who makes the best. It really celebrates this very specific part of their cultural identity. It's more than just food. It's a living demonstration of continuity.
That's amazing. And speaking of continuity, given how rustic and rooted in survival this dish is, are modern culinary trends trying to, reinvent Rakfisk?
Yeah.
Or does it kind of resist change?
That's a really interesting point. There is a bit of a tension there between strict tradition and modern approaches. You do see modern chefs who have access to, vacuum sealers, precise pH meters, perfect temperature-controlled refrigeration.
All the modern tools.
Right. They are certainly experimenting. They might introduce more contemporary elements, maybe a drizzle of dill oil, some finely pickled beetroot for sweetness and acidity. I've even heard of whiskey-infused foams being paired with it.
Oh.
But these additions are usually designed to enhance or contrast with the existing profile, pairing the inherent sourness with something sweet, or the richness with a sharp acidic element.
So they're using modern techniques maybe to refine the process or the presentation, but the core of the dish, it's still fundamentally trout, salt, thyme, and cold.
That's generally true. They're often aiming for that same fundamental buttery texture and deep umami, perhaps just with a maybe cleaner, more controlled, predictable outcome. But honestly, the vast majority of people who really cherish Rakfisk still stick to the old ways.
The rustic method.
Yeah, relying on that inherited knowledge, the feel, the smell, the look knowledge passed down through generations, rather than lab-grade measurements. In that sense, the dish really remains a living piece of history. If you connect all these pieces, the careful selection of good bacteria, that strict salt ratio, keeping the oxygen out, the two-stage temperature control Rakfisk tells such a powerful story. It's a story of incredible ingenuity, of survival against the odds, and a really deep, intuitive understanding of nature's rhythms. All developed centuries ago without a modern thermometer or chemistry set. The whole tradition really embodies that Norwegian proverb you hear. Rakfisk rewards the patient.
It absolutely does. And it's just incredible to think about the delicacy required, especially, like you said, that the line between safe, delicious food and absolute spoilage was so incredibly fine.
Razor thin.
Thinking about safety hinging entirely on that tiny 2% window for salt concentration and a pretty narrow temperature range guiding that whole autolysis process.
Yeah.
It really forces you to respect the power of that generational hands-on knowledge.
For sure. Trial and error over centuries.
So as you reflect on this ancient craft where, success wasn't found through heat, but through meticulous control of time, cold, and these precise conditions, all based on experience.
Yeah.
Maybe we can leave you with this thought.
Okay.
What other ancient survival food processes relying on similarly complex, narrow chemical balances achieved without modern instruments might still be practiced and preserved out there today? What other hidden culinary gems are defined almost entirely by patience, tradition, and maybe a little bit of daring?
Good question.
Something to ponder. We'll leave you with that thought for now.